Imagine a modern, highly advanced nuclear reactor suddenly, completely without warning, losing its vital ability to remove heat. Now imagine being trapped inside that plant's control room, cut off from the outside world, as alarms are absolutely blaring and your instruments are just contradicting each other left and right. Well, welcome to our latest explainer. Today, we're unpacking the tense, minute-by-minute events of March 28, 1979, at 3 Mile Island, Unit 2, near Middletown, Pennsylvania. We're going to explore the most serious accident in U.S. commercial nuclear power history, a crisis that literally permanently altered the American energy landscape.
Picture this. Drop yourself right into the extreme tension of that control room at exactly 4 a.m. The sun hasn't even come up yet, and suddenly the routine is just shattered. Sirens are wailing, red lights are flashing across these massive control panels. Equipment is malfunctioning in real time, and the operators, they're desperately trying to make sense of a flood of entirely conflicting information. Meanwhile, outside, the public is fast asleep, completely unaware that inside this thick concrete dome, a nuclear reactor is rapidly losing its ability to stay cool. It's the beginning of an absolutely unprecedented emergency.
Okay, let's dive straight into this. Section 1, the crisis begins. March 28, 1979. To truly grasp the gravity of 3 Mile Island, you can't just look at the aftermath. You have to look at the incredibly rapid-fire sequence of events that kicked off the disaster on that fateful morning. Look at how unbelievably fast things moved. In the very first minute, the plant lost its feed water to the steam generators. Essentially, the water flow that keeps the whole complex system balanced just stopped. Instantly, minute 2, the automatic safety measures kicked in exactly as they were designed to. The turbine and the reactor automatically shut down, but with the system effectively slammed shut, by minute 3, pressure inside the primary system began to rapidly, dangerously rise. To relieve that pressure, an automatic relief valve popped open. So far, the safety systems were doing exactly what they were supposed to do, but in minute 4, everything changed.
You see, that relief valve was only supposed to stay open just long enough to bleed off the excess pressure. Once the pressure dropped back down to safe levels, it was designed to close shut. But it didn't. It got completely stuck open. And here's the really terrifying part. Because of the way the indicators were designed in the control room, the operators had absolutely no idea it was stuck. So vital radioactive cooling water was secretly leaking away from the reactor core, just escaping totally unnoticed into the containment building. The reactor was bleeding out, and the operators were effectively flying blind at the true danger.
This brings us to Section 2, a chain of failures, and how small errors snowballed.
You know, this wasn't one massive explosion or a single catastrophic rupture. What makes 3 Mile Island so chilling, and honestly so fascinating from an engineering perspective, is that it was a creeping, incredibly confusing chain of interconnected technical and human failures. It was a snowball effect. You have equipment malfunctions, right? Like the stuck valve. Then you add in design-related problems and terribly misleading indications. I mean, the control panel literally told the operators the valve was commanded to close, but it didn't show them its actual physical position. So operating under this totally confusing and inaccurate data, the operators made a fatal error. Convinced the system somehow had too much water, rather than too little. They made the operational decision to reduce the cooling flow. They actually turned down the water exactly when the reactor core desperately needed it most.
Which leads right into Section 3, the partial meltdown. The core overheats.
As that cooling flow was manually reduced, the water level inside the reactor violently dropped, fully exposing the incredibly hot nuclear fuel rods. Without water to carry the intense heat away, the tension inside that vessel reached its absolute climax. The fuel rods began to physically overheat. The metal cladding started reacting and breaking down. The core of the Unit 2 reactor was now experiencing a full-on partial meltdown. The internal damage was just staggering. A massive portion of the Unit 2 core literally melted and collapsed in on itself under the extreme, unmitigated heat. It was severely damaged, cementing this forever as a landmark event in the history of commercial nuclear power. Nothing even close to this had ever happened in the United States before.
Now let's look at Section 4, fear versus reality. What the public saw versus what the data actually showed.
Now, what's really interesting here is that while a physical climax was happening silently inside the plant's heavily shielded walls, an entirely different kind of explosion was happening outside, an explosion of absolute public panic. The gap between what was happening inside that reactor and what the public believed was happening across the country was massive. The story rapidly became one of sheer terror, this widespread fear of radioactive contamination sweeping across America, fueled by rumors and terrible communication. But on the other hand, the strict reality, well, according to thorough investigations by the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, or NRC, it was vastly different. Yes, there were off-site radioactive releases, for sure, but they were relatively small. In fact, the data showed zero detectable health effects on plant workers or the general public. The physical threat to the public was minimal, even though the psychological terror was off the charts.
And it's absolutely vital to make a firm distinction here, because 3 Mile Island is so often wrongly lumped together with other historical nuclear disasters. 3 Mile Island involved a partial core meltdown with relatively small off-site releases. Why? Largely because the containment building worked exactly as intended and held the vast majority of the radiation inside. It is completely different from Chernobyl or Fukushima. Those accidents had fundamentally different causes, entirely different reactor designs, and resulted in massive, incredibly catastrophic external consequences. Understanding this distinction is absolutely key to understanding the true historical reality of what happened in Pennsylvania.
Moving right along to Section 5, Cleanup and Government Response, the long road to recovery. Once the reactor was finally stabilized and the immediate crisis was averted, the real, grueling work began. The aftermath triggered an immediate, sweeping government response, and it marked the very beginning of one of the most highly complex and dangerous cleanup operations in industrial history. Just think about this number for a second. 5 long, agonizing years. The accident happened in 1979, but it wasn't until 1985 that workers could even begin the process of safely removing the damaged, highly radioactive nuclear fuel from the reactor. And that specific fuel removal process, that wasn't even fully completed until 1990.
The cleanup itself demanded truly unprecedented levels of extensive monitoring, intricate decontamination, and incredibly complex waste management. But looking beyond the physical cleanup, the accident triggered a massive regulatory overhaul. The NRC was forced to permanently transform how it oversaw the entire industry. They vastly increased the emphasis on operator training, ensuring no crew would ever be confused by a stuck valve again. They demanded human factors engineering improvements. Essentially, that means control panels had to actually make intuitive sense to the humans trying to use them under pressure. They completely overhauled emergency preparedness, implemented way stricter radiation protection guidelines, and mandated severe accident analysis across the board. The entire industry was fundamentally rebuilt from the ground up from a safety perspective.
And that brings us to our final part, Section 6, the permanent legacy. Why 3 Mile Island still matters today.
3 Mile Island became the ultimate turning point for the U.S. nuclear industry. It proved definitively that a catastrophic reactor event doesn't require a bomb or an earthquake or a massive natural disaster. It can develop through a subtle, creeping mix of minor equipment failures, confusing data, and flawed human decisions made under extreme pressure. Which leaves us with this final, profound thought to reflect upon as we wrap up this explainer. How did a series of small, seemingly manageable failures turn a totally routine morning at a modern power plant into the most serious accident in U.S. commercial nuclear history? The answer really lies in that complex intersection of man and machine. 3 Mile Island absolutely terrified a nation, but in doing so, it forced a crisis that permanently revolutionized nuclear safety, ensuring that the dark hours of March 28, 1979 would never, ever be repeated.